Okay, there is a number of things I want to cover in this video, so bear with me. The latest news on the Essex tragedy, the lorry found at Grays, is that there appeared to be a number of Vietnamese nationals on board. There was a sad case of a young woman who was texting her family as she died. She couldn't breathe. There is something unusual about this case. Looking at that young woman, she isn't exactly the sort of stereotype of a migrant. You know, she didn't look dirt poor. She obviously had a smartphone on this journey. But it still poses a question: why are these people taking these risks in this way? There is a difference, of course, between trafficking and smuggling. Trafficking is like people are being illegally enslaved and transported that way. Smuggling is that people are putting themselves into this situation, and it looks like this was smuggling. Doesn't make it any less tragic. Still, it's just baffling that people would feel that their lives have so little hope that they have to take these sort of risks. So like I say, there is that Vietnamese component, but there is also, it's still being seen that a lot of the victims were Chinese. I think it's going to be very painstaking to identify everyone. I know the police were saying that they wanted people to come forward, and they put the caveat like people may be worried if they have a legal status, but they just want to, help their next of kin. I hope people do that, because if they don't, all it will do is prolong the suffering of the families. But what caught my attention yesterday, among other things, was a response by Global Times, which is a pretty nasty rag. It's China's leading state mouthpiece, basically. Surprise, surprise, they're blaming the British authorities, or at least partially blaming the British authorities, saying that it happened on our watch, happened on the watch of Europeans, and they're basically washing their hands of it. No sort of notion of why did these people leave China in the first place? Why was life obviously so difficult in China that they felt the need to come to the UK? And this is so typical of the Chinese Communist Party. Sheer arrogance, utter refusal to ever take responsibility for anything. It's always someone else's fault. It's always the fault of the British or the French or the Americans or the Canadians or the Hong Kongers or the Taiwanese or anyone that isn't China. This is in keeping with the ultra-nationalistic philosophy of the Xi era, more so than other Chinese presidents, I might say. It was starting to emerge in the Hu Jintao era, but it's been particularly prominent in the Xi Jinping era. Firstly, that the claim is utterly absurd. I mean, we don't know when these people died. We do have a responsibility to improve security and crack down on people traffickers and anyone involved in this vile business, and arrests have been made. But for Global Times to take advantage of this tragedy to score political points by pointing fingers at the West is pathetic. It does, of course, strike a stark contrast to the so-called Chinese dream and all the hyped up nationalism we saw around October the 1st. The BBC interviewed some Vietnamese men, and this is going back to the Vietnamese component, who hadn't even heard of the tragedy. So clearly, whether people are blocking that news from them or what, I don't know. I was somewhat surprised to see that this had made news on Chinese social media. Not that I can read Chinese, but I could say I knew what the case was, because I knew they were covering it because it showed that lorry at the I think it was called the Waterglade Industrial Park. So it was clear that, and it had 39 in the, I can't read Chinese, but it had the 39, obviously 39 dead people. So I'd be interested to know what sort of angle they're covering it from on the Chinese social media. None of my Chinese contacts have said anything about it, like, oh Nathan, did you know 39 Chinese died in your country, or anything like that. But it's just so predictable and frustrating that the Communist Party mouthpiece would try and find some angle to blame the West for this, instead of saying, well, what's our responsibility to improve lives of people here so they don't feel the need to leave? And it may be true that they've lifted millions out of poverty, but China, for all its boasts, it's the second biggest economy, but in terms of GDP per head, it's still a developing country. It ranks somewhere around the middle. China is a powerful country, but I suspect not quite as powerful as either it or the rest of the world believe. And I think that that's something needs to be scrutinised a little bit more. I'm not saying it's not significant. It's very, very significant. And it is genuinely powerful. It's a totally different country from when Mao declared the PRC in 1949. It has a major military. It has a major clout in the world. It has veto power at the UN Permanent Security Council. It's a major player. But I think that the trade war may be having some effect. And I think I'm starting to see signs of more assertiveness from some Western governments. Not all. Certainly not mine. And I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But I think that when the Chinese Communist Party responds angrily, they have a tantrum, it shows that they're rattled, and it shows that they're nervous. I mean, on one hand, yes, they're powerful, but on the other hand, this is a regime that is scared of Winnie the Pooh. So it's almost laughable. They have this Jekyll and Hyde persona. I've always said that that combination of hypersensitivity and hyperaggression is very dangerous, but it also shows a fundamental lack of security. I mean, China is not... I don't believe the Chinese Communist Party is actually that confident. I believe they put on a facade of confidence. But I think they are constantly paranoid. They're constantly looking at ways to control people. They're constantly worried of any sort of uprising. At the moment, there isn't any sense that in mainland China there's any sort of appetite for a revolution or anything like that. I think most Chinese, unfortunately, don't really care about human rights and stuff like that. They are just thinking about their day-to-day lives. So at the moment, that's relatively okay for them. They're, the middle class has increased. They're just getting on by their day-to-day lives. But I think if the totalitarianism increases, if the sort of measures that the Xi government is taking domestically to control people keeps increasing, even the Chinese, with the education system they have, are going to get tired of this at some point and start, asking questions or start showing their dissatisfaction with it. There is actually a number of incidents happen every year where you get local people angrily protest against, for example, development that might be going through an ancestral cemetery and so on. Of course, state media will never show this because they don't want the wider public to know that. But the idea that it's all one big happy sort of family is absolute nonsense. I think there is probably a lot of Chinese who are dissatisfied, but either they're afraid to show it because of this hyper-nationalism that's going on, so you can't criticise the government, or it's just being effectively covered up by the government. I think it's one of those things. And plus there is a lot of genuine nationalists who will, go out of their way to shame their fellow citizens. So yeah, that's what's happening in China. What we need to be concerned about is how do we respond to it. In Britain, I mentioned recently about the situation in our universities. That's something I am very concerned about, and I have to say, very angry about. But actually more angry with British universities than the Chinese themselves. I mean, they're behaving in an obnoxious way. They're bullying other students, they're threatening other students, they're taking advantage of our freedom, and in my opinion, in those cases where there's evidence against them, they should immediately be expelled and, as far as I'm concerned, kicked out of the country. But as with so much in this country, we only take action at the last minute. The government has made a few sounds in the right direction, but I still think we need to be a lot more outspoken. Mike Pence has just condemned the treatment of Uyghurs, and Beijing responded predictably with a tantrum accusing him of arrogance and hypocrisy. I'm not sure what the hypocrisy is specifically. I mean, where are the groups of religious people in America that are being brutally persecuted, sent to concentration camps? There's no comparison. And I'm, my politics don't exactly align with Mike Pence, but there needs to be more people like Mike Pence and Peter Dutton. Whatever your politics are, let's say you are really anti-Republican. Okay, we'll call on the Democrats to do it. This shouldn't be a left-right issue. This should be an issue of knowing what is going on and being assertive. China is no friend of the West. And we need to just wake up and see what China is playing at. Because I honestly believe that what's happened is we've or rather Western governments have had this idea that with economic progress, and China has developed economically, there would be political changes. That hasn't happened. Under Xi Jinping, it's only got worse. It's only got more controlling, more totalitarian. So that theory just hasn't come to fruition. I don't believe that Beijing can be trusted. Yes, it's true that they rely on us to an extent, but they've also got... I said earlier, I don't think they're that confident. That's true on some level, but I also think that they're confident enough to test the grounds, to push the West only so far. So they'll hype up the students to behave the way they're behaving. They'll throw angry tantrums every time they don't get their way. So they're testing the ground, I think, particularly with Australia, because Australia is geographically much closer than Britain and Canada and other Western countries. We need to absolutely support Australia 110%. We need a collective effort against China, because what they're doing is you get individual ministers and politicians who speak out. Excuse me, I'm just... yeah. I was just checking the other laptop. I was getting some message on it. We need to speak out. We need to just be a lot more assertive. And I think, frankly, we need to take the gloves off. We need to stop being so damn polite. So if the Chinese regime accuses us of meddling in China's internal affairs, we need to respond. They have no evidence for that as a state policy. And rather, it is China who's meddling in our affairs by stoking up students. We absolutely should not allow CGTN to operate in London. Of course, the government will say that's not their domain, it's up to Ofcom. Ofcom will then pass the buck. That's what irritates me. People always want to pass the buck and not take responsibility. Someone in this country has given a license to CGTN to operate in London. So they've given the license, they could very easily take the license away. So why are they wasting time? CGTN has aired forced confessions. CGTN is a mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party. And you can look at this in a lot of different areas. Global Times, 45 million likes on Facebook. Why are they allowed to operate on Facebook? Facebook is supposed to be a forum that values free speech, that values the ideals of democracy and openness. I guess Chinese money is just too tempting for Mark Zuckerberg and his colleagues. It just seems grotesque that they give a totalitarian single-party dictatorship a platform when dissidents in China have no voice. It infuriates me, and when I have to stop myself from overthinking these things, because I get very depressed and very angry. I just think we are being way too subservient. And I'm not saying everyone in government is like that. For example, I give Jeremy Hunt credit. He's been more outspoken than most British ministers, although he's no longer in government. Dominic Raab has made some of the right overtures, but I think we could do a lot more. I think we can start to use the same language that they're using against us. We can accuse China of bullying behaviour. We can just tell the truth. Say what they're doing. Say we know about it and they need to back off. I get that China's an important world player, so we cannot totally cut China off. But I do believe we could do a lot more than what we're doing, and I believe that unfortunately Chinese money still speaks. But if there was a collective effort, if we work with our other Five Eyes partners and other Western democracies, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Ireland, you name it, any country, because the thing is, this is not just about America, this is not just about Britain. What Western countries need to understand, they're all targets of the Chinese regime. Any country, for example, a Uyghur activist has just been awarded the Sakharov Prize by the European Union. Well, of course, China's responded with a tantrum. I think we need to actually provoke China more, not just for the sake of it, but because if we do not stand up for our values, China's going to keep blackmailing us. They're going to keep saying, oh well, we'll cut off trade if you don't kind of do what we say. And their notion of meddling in our internal affairs is simply pointing out the facts. So it infuriates me, for example, that our universities are being so weak and they're sitting on the fence when there is abundant evidence to show what Chinese students are doing. Why are these students not being expelled? I'm looking also at the Kong Linding case. The outcome's supposed to be on the 31st. My goodness, a lot's happening on that day. But let's say, because it's supposed to be the Grenville inquiry the same day, and of course it's supposedly Brexit day, but I really, really think that the West is only kind of half woken up. China is no friend of the West. I'm not suggesting we get into a Cold War with China, but we cannot trust Beijing. This is a party whose very survival has depended on lies. They've been lying to their own people for 70 years. So are Westerners so naive? Are those in power so naive to think that we can trust the Chinese? We can't. I don't think it's a case of let's just totally cut off all contact. That is obviously not possible, and I don't think it would actually be a good idea either, because we may have to cooperate with them, for example, on international crime, counter-terrorism. There may be areas we have no choice but to cooperate with them on. Let's say a British national got into trouble with China. If we totally cut off links, then they could just say, oh well, to hell with you, we're not going to talk to you. So unfortunately we do have to have some relationship. But I think we really need to show Beijing we're not going to be pushed around. We're not going to, pander to their little tantrums. And we need to show that we are also a strong country. And, what about our face? What about our pride? We may not be as powerful as China today, but we need to show, if Brexit is about anything, if it really is about taking back control, we need to show we can stand up to a country as powerful as China. We've done the right thing with Russia, in my opinion. We kicked out Russian diplomats in response to Salisbury. I still think it's a disgrace that RT can operate here. I see absolutely no basis for that, but at least the May government done the right thing by taking tough action against those diplomats, but we could do so much more. Russian aggression is manifested in different ways. There's barely any Russian students here, so that isn't really a factor. With China, it's so-called soft power. These students aren't soldiers. They're not. Most of them probably are not spies, but they're being hyped up and they're being used as pawns, in my opinion. We need to recognise what's going on. Our universities need to be stopped. You just look at Sheffield University. They have a whole segment boasting about the relations with China. It's infuriating, because this is not a level playing field. It's just not. They'll talk about, oh, we're getting Chinese investment. So what? What does money count for if we're selling out our values, our sovereignty, and allowing Chinese students to behave the way they're behaving? Where is our sovereignty as a nation if we are allowing a hostile foreign power to use its media mouthpiece to smear and slander this country, to insult us? We really, really need to show China that we can see what we're doing. We need to be a lot more outspoken. We need to start using their language against them, in my opinion. So, they talk about the bullying of China. We talk about China bullying the West. They talk about outrageous claims. We retort. We say China's claims are outrageous. They have no evidence whatsoever, for example, that as a matter of policy, Britain is interfering in China as a matter of policy. Because there's absolutely no way a group of British people could go to China and behave the way some Chinese nationals are behaving here. Final point, if you are Chinese, I always say in my videos, my issues with the Chinese government and the way it's behaving, I've never been against the average Chinese person, unless you are being aggressive and disrespectful of this country. But that's all I could say. If you choose to take offence to this, not my problem. I've been honest, I've been very clear what I mean. If you choose to misinterpret it, nothing I could do about that. So, I don't know what it's going to take. Is it actually going to take an actual incident like the Salisbury attack? Maybe, for example, mass hacking, for us to actually get some backbone and stand up to China. Australia's doing it, America's doing it, Britain's not. We could do a hell of a lot more.